Partners in crime. Imagine you've been hiding a dark secret for 32 years. You've changed your name, built a new life, managed to stay completely under the radar, and successfully dodged the law for decades. Then one day, you think you're about to die, so you spill the beans, only to miraculously survive and get arrested. Sounds hilarious, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to James Brewer, but here's how the drama all started. So apparently in 1997, in Tennessee, USA, James Brewer was your typical Southern guy who had one tiny, itty-bitty problem. He had murdered a man named Jimmy Carroll. Turns out James was convinced that Carroll was flirting with his wife, but instead of, having a conversation or maybe just blocking the guy's number, he went straight to homicide. After shooting Carroll dead, Brewer realized that Tennessee wasn't the best place to be when you've just committed murder. So instead of waiting around for the cops, he and his wife Dorothy packed their bags and disappeared faster than a free donut at a police station. James and Dorothy fled to Oklahoma, changed their last name, and started living as the Andersons. And for 32 years, they lived like law-abiding, everyday citizens. James became a devoted churchgoer, and the couple even got involved in their community. It seemed like James had completely gotten away with it. There were no leads, no detectives knocking on their door, and no dramatic police chases. Just peaceful, small-town life. Well, until karma showed up. In 2009, James Brewer suffered a stroke. He was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors weren't sure if he was going to make it. James, thinking he was about to meet his maker, had a sudden realization. Uh-oh, I should probably clear my conscience before I go. So, in a moment of moral awakening, James called the cops from his hospital bed and confessed everything. Yes, he literally dialed up the authorities and gave himself up. He told them about the 1977 murder, his escape, and how he had been living under a fake name for 3 decades. He even apologized for what he had done, saying that he had found God and wanted to die with a clean soul. The police, who were probably not even looking for him, would have honestly found this update very funny. But here's where the story gets absolutely ridiculous. James didn't die. Instead of passing away peacefully, he recovered. And you know what happens when you confess to murder while still breathing? You get arrested. The police wasted 0 time. As soon as James was well enough to leave the hospital, he was escorted straight to jail. Talk about making a grave mistake. The baby killing scandal. So, this event happened at the Tuam Mother and Baby Home, a convent-run institution in Tuam, Ireland, where unwed mothers were sent to have their babies. Now, this wasn't some cozy maternity ward with prenatal yoga and baby showers. Nope. It was more like, congratulations, you're pregnant and unmarried, so time to be shunned and locked away. From the 1920s to the 1960s, thousands of young women were sent to Tuam, and their babies were taken away, sometimes for adoption, sometimes, well, not for adoption. The nuns running the place were strict, and by strict, I mean they made Professor Snape look like a cuddly teddy bear. These women were given grueling work, little food, and no contact with the outside world. And their babies? Well, let's just say that the mortality rate at this convent was higher than a Black Friday sale at a department store. However, several decades later, a Sister Mary was on her deathbed, and as she lay there knowing that she was about to clock out of life permanently, she started talking. She confessed that hundreds of babies had died at the convent under their care. But wait, it gets worse. Instead of giving these babies proper burials, the nuns had secretly dumped their tiny bodies in a mass grave. This mass grave was actually a freaking septic tank. Yeah, you heard that right. These babies, whose only crime was being born to unmarried mothers, were discarded like garbage. No gravestone, no records, no dignity. Just tossed away like leftovers from Sunday dinner. Well, after Sister Mary gave up the ghost, people started connecting the dots, and let's just say those dots painted a very ugly picture. In 2014, a historian named Catherine Corliss started digging, literally, and discovered official records of nearly 800 babies who had died at the Tuam home. But they had no burial records. This led to excavations, and what they found confirmed the nuns' confession: the remains of hundreds of babies in an old septic system. And the worst part is that some of these poor babies showed signs of malnutrition, neglect, and even mistreatment. Translation: these babies didn't just die, they suffered. The Irish government was forced to investigate, and the scandal exposed. And the Catholic Church, which had been running the place, issued statements. But let's be real, people already saw the situation for what it truly was. Mr. Poison. Eugene Toombs was, by all accounts, a nice, quiet man. You know, the type of guy who waves at his neighbors, helps old ladies cross the street, and, oh yeah, murdered his wife for insurance money. Bet you didn't see that coming. For years, people thought his wife died of natural causes, but on his deathbed, Eugene decided it was time for a plot twist worthy of a crime thriller. As Eugene lay there gasping for his last breaths, he gathered his family around. His loved ones leaned in, expecting some heartfelt wisdom or maybe a classic "I love you all" moment, but instead he looked them dead in the eyes and said, "So, remember my wife? Yeah, she didn't just die. I poisoned her." Imagine the sheer horror and confusion that would have been in that hospital room. The nurse probably checked his meds twice to make sure he wasn't getting drugged. But wait, it gets worse. After dropping the "hey, I killed my wife" bombshell, Eugene also confessed to killing 3 more women. Turns out Eugene had been killing women and cashing in on their life insurance policies for years. The man had turned marriage into a lucrative business plan. But instead of divorce, he went for a much more permanent solution. He'd slowly poison them to make their deaths look natural. I mean, there'd be no signs of struggle, no suspicious wounds, just a loving husband playing the grieving widower while collecting fat insurance checks. By the time Eugene confessed, there was absolutely nothing anyone could do. He was seconds away from kicking the bucket. So he casually unburdened himself and dipped out of life like a mic drop moment. The authorities later dug into his past and found evidence that supported his confession. Unfortunately, since he was already more dead than his murder victims, they don't really put him on trial. It was the ultimate got away with it moment, except now everyone knew he was a monster. His name was forever tainted, and his family was left reeling, going from mourning him to realizing they were related to a serial killer. Honestly, the emotional whiplash would have been hilarious if it wasn't so grim. Nazi's secret. So, for decades, David Nielsen was just your average Midwestern grandpa. He lived in a quiet neighborhood, probably mowed his lawn early every Sunday, and maybe even spoiled his grandkids with some Werther's Originals. But here's the thing, David Nielsen never actually existed. Get this, the man lying in that hospital bed had been living under a stolen identity for years, hiding from a past so dark that even the Grim Reaper would call it messed up. Apparently, as he lay there dying, the guilt of his past caught up with him, and with his final breaths, he admitted that he was actually a former SS officer who had participated in horrific war crimes during World War II. Yep, the man was a frickin' Nazi soldier. Apparently, back in the 1940s, when the war ended and Nazi officers were either facing execution, rotting in prison, or running for their lives, Mr. Not Really David Nielsen somehow slipped through the cracks, changed his name, and managed to sneak into the United States where he completely reinvented himself. No one knew his real past, no one suspected a thing, and just like that, he went from war criminal to average Midwestern dude, blending in like an expert chameleon. He even got married, had kids, probably even paid taxes, and went to PTA meetings, which is honestly more than some actual Americans do. For decades, this man completely erased his old identity, dodging justice while living a normal life. Well, until he was old, gray, and on his deathbed in 1993. He probably felt guilty, and with his family by his side, he confessed to all the terrible things he did as a Nazi, and even told them that David Nielsen wasn't even his name. I can only imagine the conversation went something like this. "Grandpa, what?" "Yeah, about that." "Are you serious?" Yep, he dropped that historical plot twist and then promptly exited stage left. What's even crazier is that the man didn't even tell them his real name, so even when the authorities looked into his past, they couldn't confirm exactly who he was or what crimes he had committed. Wild West law. The year was 1946, and America was fresh out of World War II. But while the world was busy celebrating victory, racism in the South was still alive and kicking, like a cockroach that just won't die. And this is where Moore's Ford lynching happened, and till today remains one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. So, basically, Roger and Dorothy Malcolm, who were a black couple, and George and May Murray Dorsey, another black couple, were driving near Monroe, Georgia. Roger had recently been bailed out of jail after allegedly stabbing a white man, so as you can imagine, tensions were high. Suddenly, a mob of around 20 white men appeared like a gang of discount villains. They dragged the two couples out of their car, tied them up, and took them to a desolate area near Moore's Ford Bridge. Then, in a horrific act of racist violence, they shot all 4 of them more than 60 times. and just to make sure they were dead, because apparently bullets weren't enough, they also mutilated the bodies afterward. It was a massacre, and despite national outrage and an FBI investigation ordered by President Truman, nobody was ever convicted, because Georgia in the 40s was basically like a real-life gameplay of GTA 5. For decades, the case remained ice cold. Everyone in town knew who did it, but the unspoken rule was shut up or else. Witnesses mysteriously changed their stories, and juries were about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Then, in 1993, something crazy happened. Henry Alexander, a white man from Georgia who had lived his life like nothing happened, was on his deathbed. Now, if Hollywood has taught us anything, it's that people love to confess their sins before they kick the bucket, because apparently eternal judgment is scarier than the FBI. With his final breaths, Henry turned to his wife and dropped a bombshell. "I was there. I helped do it." Mic drop. The wife, who had probably just been preparing for a peaceful, sentimental goodbye, suddenly realized she had married a full-on murderer. Imagine spending decades with someone only to find out on their deathbed that they were part of a racist lynch mob. Well, after his confession, Henry died, but the wife had some talking to do, and thankfully she did the right thing. Instead of keeping her husband's dirty little secret, she went to the authorities and confirmed what everyone in Monroe, Georgia already knew but pretended not to. Her husband had been one of the killers. But, and this is a big but, it was too late. Henry was already decomposing, and the other killers were either dead or too old to stand trial. The authorities couldn't even prosecute anyone because Georgia's legal system was still moving at the speed of a sleepy sloth. Just like that, the case remained technically unsolved, even though the truth was finally out. Killer's confession. Terry Rasmussen was the kind of guy who could vanish into thin air, switch identities like he was in an RPG, and murder people along the way. He had a few different names, including Bob Evans, Larry Vanner, and even Gordon Jensen. His criminal activities spanned decades, and authorities now believe he was behind at least 5 murders, but his real body count still remains unknown. The dude basically played Where's Waldo with the law, except instead of a red and white striped sweater, he wore handcuffs and a smug grin. One of his most infamous crimes is the Bear Brook murders in New Hampshire, and this happened in 1985. A hunter who was wandering around Bear Brook State Park stumbled upon a giant blue barrel that contained 2 decomposing bodies. Fast forward 15 years to 2000, and authorities find another barrel nearby with more bodies inside. At this point, the forest is basically a discount horror movie set. The victims were a woman and 3 little girls. Their bodies had been in the barrel since the late 1970s or early 1980s, and guess who was living in the area at the time? Yep, you guessed it, Terry frickin' Rasmussen. But back then, nobody connected the dots because this guy was hopping from state to state, changing his name like he was in a witness protection program from himself. Rasmussen was finally arrested in 2002 under yet another fake name, Larry Vanner, for the murder of Yunsun Jun, a chemist from California who unfortunately had the misfortune of dating him. By the time they arrested him, he was old, sick, and running out of time. But rather than spill all his secrets like a broken piñata, he just gave vague hints. Because when investigators pressed him on the Bear Brook murders, he just smirked and said it was all in the barrels. Yep, that's the best he could do. This guy was dying and all he had was to give us a bad riddle. Unfortunately, Terry Rasmussen died in 2010 in prison, but he took most of his secrets with him. Now, most people on their deathbeds would either repent for their sins or spill all the tea, but not Terry. Instead, he refused to confess to anything specific. He let people believe he was connected to other murders, but he never actually said where the rest of the bodies were, who his other victims were, or how many people he had killed. The dude left us on a cliffhanger. However, even after his death, investigators kept digging. Thanks to DNA testing, they were able to confirm that one of the victims in the Bear Brook barrels was Rasmussen's biological daughter. So not only was he a murderer, but he also killed his own child. What's even worse is that one of the girls in the barrels has still never been identified. To this day, she is known only as Unknown Child, and police still don't know who she was or where she came from. Meanwhile, Rasmussen's other identities, movements, and possible victims remain a giant mystery. Loch Ness hoax. For centuries, people in Scotland whispered about a mysterious creature lurking in Loch Ness, a deep, murky lake that looks like the kind of place where something weird should be hiding. The legend was old, but it wasn't until the early 20th century that things got real. And by real, I mean a whole lot of people started seeing things. Fishermen claimed their nets were getting snatched by an unseen beast. Tourists swore they saw a long-necked creature gliding across the water. And of course, some people just wanted an excuse to drink whiskey by the lake and call it monster hunting. But in 1934, the game changed forever. Robert Kenneth Wilson, a British surgeon who had supposedly captured the first ever clear photograph of Nessie. The image basically showed a long, elegant neck rising from the water, looking like a cross between a dinosaur and a confused goose. The world went nuts. Newspapers splashed the image everywhere, and suddenly Nessie wasn't just a Scottish legend, she was a full-blown international celebrity. Scientists debated, monster hunters packed their bags, and tourism in Loch Ness exploded. But here's the thing, Wilson never wanted his name attached to the photo. He insisted he just happened to be there when the creature surfaced. And having this mystery attached to a doctor gave the hoax an air of legitimacy because, I mean, if a fancy British surgeon says it's real, who's gonna argue? It turns out a lot of people should have. Fast forward 60 years to 1994. By this time, Nessie had been a global sensation for decades. There were expeditions, documentaries, blurry videos, and even some very questionable 1970s movies about the monster. And then on his deathbed, an elderly man named Christian Sperling made a confession that rocked the world. The entire thing had been a frickin' prank. Apparently, the monster in the famous photo was a toy submarine with a fake head stuck on top. And the people behind the prank was Sperling himself along with his stepfather, Marmaduke Wetherell, and a few accomplices. The whole reason for this was to get sweet, sweet revenge. Turns out this whole hoax wasn't even about Nessie, it was about embarrassing the Daily Mail newspaper. You see, Marmaduke Wetherell was a filmmaker and big game hunter. In the early 1930s, he was hired by the Daily Mail to find proof of the Loch Ness Monster. So he went to Scotland, where he discovered giant Nessie footprints on the shore. The newspaper published the story in a frenzy until scientists took one look and went, these are elephant footprints. Yep, someone had stomped around Loch Ness with an elephant foot-shaped object, and Wetherell got publicly humiliated. The Daily Mail mocked him, ruined his reputation, and sent him packing. Wetherell, still fuming, gathered his stepson Sperling, a sculptor, and a couple of other mischief makers. They built a 14-inch model of Nessie's head and neck, attached it to a toy submarine, sailed it out into the loch, and snapped some dramatic photos. Then they gave the pictures to Wilson, the surgeon, because they knew having a respectable person would make it more believable. And well, it worked like a charm. The Daily Mail published it, Wetherell got the last laugh, and for 60 years the world believed in a bathtub toy. However, even after Sperling spilled the beans, Loch Ness tourism never slowed down. People still flocked to the lake hoping to see a real Nessie. Sonar scans and underwater cameras have searched every inch of the water looking for dinosaurs. In fact, the Loch Ness Monster is now a multi-million-dollar industry with souvenirs, boat tours, and a Nessie-shaped hotel.